All right, peace and greetings, YouTubers. So welcome to another edition of In the News. Always great to chop it up with you all. I had a really great weekend, by the way. I went and I saw The Whispers. Really great show. Like, they had an 8-piece band, and of course, like I've said before, if your band is together and on point, you can win me over. Like, if the band is on point, the background singers are on point, even if you weren't doing much on stage, I'll probably still give your show a little bit of credit just because of how everything was presented and how it all came together cohesively. But they had a really great show. Lots of fun. And what I liked is that, one, because it was a smaller venue, it was at the Birchmere in Alexandria, Virginia. And that's one of the venues where, you know, you can sit at the tables and you eat your food as they perform on the stage nearby. And so it was a really great show. And I'm not that familiar with their material from before the 80s. Like, I know all of their stuff that came out in the 80s. But, you know, they had a whole career. Like, they're a group that had, like, 2 waves in their career. So they came out in, I want to say, 68, 69. And they had a run through the 70s. And literally, they were actually about to call it quits. And then here comes And the Beat Goes On, the song, in 1980. And, of course, it's this big, giant smash. And it ushers in the next wave of their career through the 80s. And so, you know, then those are all the songs I know, like the And the Beat Goes On and It's a Love Thing and Rock Steady, and then my personal favorite, Get You in the Mood. And so it was nice to hear those songs from the 70s that I wasn't too familiar with and just see how they were presented with that band. It sounded really nice. It was really nice. One of the bits that's funny, though, I ain't gonna lie, some of those older women in the audience, because by the way, I was definitely probably the youngest person in there because this was also Howard Homecoming weekend and it was a Saturday night. And so nobody my age in their right mind is going to be at the Whispers concert as opposed to enjoying, you know, everything going on in the city. But then there's me. So I was just sitting there kind of like people watching. But some of the women in the audience, Lord, you want to talk about just wow? Just, y'all can't talk about my generation anymore. I was sitting here looking at the thirst that came from the audience with some of the people. One of the funniest bits was there was this woman that was like at the same table that I was at, because, you know, it's like shared space. So, you know, you get your party for 2 or 3. Like me and my godmom went and some other folks, but she was at our table and she kept getting up and trying to get to that stage because the stage is like literally right there. So every time her song would come on the way, she would get up there and run and just twist and try to get the guy's hand and have him sing to her, and then she melt all over his hand. But towards the end of the show, they closed the show out with Rocksteady. And of course, here she goes again, running to that stage. But this time she was trying to wind the chest in here and show a little piece of thigh from the dress. I'm like, what you doing? But I was going to let her live her dream. Go ahead, you do you. It was a lot of fun. It was hilarious, though. And apparently that show they were recording a live album. So there was my show, and then there was a show the next night. And I guess they were going to take the best of both and put it in an album. So we'll see what comes of that. But really fun show. I always like to go and see the acts who are from before my era, just because I want to say that I've seen them. So there's been a long list of legends and those who've come before that I've been fortunate enough to see, some who are no longer living. So, you know, I'm glad that I was able to see somebody like Aretha or some of the others. Or, you know, when I saw like Gladys and the OJs and Patty and Stevie and I don't know, I'm just a big concert junkie. I love going to shows. So really great time. And then, like I said, it was Howard University homecoming. So I guess I have to segue into Kanye. I really didn't feel like talking about him because he's already been given like 2 or 3 videos on his channel. And my opinion still stands from those videos. But, you know, I was bombarded with a plethora of requests and comments like, when are you going to talk about Kanye? Mainly because I went to Howard, so people wanted to know what I thought about Kanye bringing his Sunday service to Howard University on a Saturday and just all of that. And, you know, folks were like, yeah, because, you know, we didn't think Howard students would really buy into that, but it looks like there was a bunch of them out there. And I was like, oh, well, really? In my head, it was just all the freshmen, okay? It was the freshmen. Like, they've only been on the campus for 2-3 months. They still got a lot to learn. All they've been taking so far is freshman seminar and PE, so they haven't even got the experience yet. You got to be there all 4 years for everything to align. But no, I'm just kidding. I don't know who was out there. I didn't actually go. Apparently, his people sent an email out at 6 in the morning to Howard University students, and then I guess the show or the service was at 8 o'clock. Here's my 2 cents. I could spend all day talking about the Trump bit or what I think about the Sunday service, but I want to actually focus on something else that I actually really have the bigger issue with. Because again, folks started coming with the parade of black folks are not a monolith and so on and so on. And I get that. However, society still treats all black folks the same way. So no matter how individualistic you may want to be with your viewpoints, society's still going to treat you the same way eventually, depending on whatever circumstance you find yourself under. But the piece I want to talk about is he's still going and pushing that whole slavery was a choice narrative. And the fact that he went on Howard University's campus and said that foolishness, I was like, see, Howard, that's what happens when y'all always try to ride the wave of celebrity and just let anybody on campus to come and do any and everything. And so let me play just the little piece that he said that caught me off guard that I saw on Instagram, and then we'll chat.
If they throwing slave nets again, how about we don't all stand in the exact same place?
Foolishness. You see, this is exactly what I'm talking about. And actually, I did a video on this subject maybe a year ago, but I never put the video out because I didn't like how I presented it. Sometimes if y'all see me go a week without a video, or maybe a week or two, sometimes I've done 2 or 3 videos, but I didn't like them, and so they just never came out. But the video was talking about how I really think it's in poor taste when people go and pretty much kind of curb stump over the experiences of the ancestors. And, you know, as far as like people saying things like, oh, you know, slavery, I couldn't have been no slave because I would have done this and this and I was going to be free, and everybody who did that, they were foolish. Or when you see people wear the shirts like, I am not my ancestors, because, you see your great grandparents getting beat up on the street by the fire department and the police and the dogs biting their arm and everything like that. And, oh, that wasn't going to be me. F that. I just think that's in such poor taste, because those experiences that they had to endure pretty much opened the door for us to even be in a space where we could almost have the nerve to want to critique their experience. I just think it's in poor taste. And one, you're also speaking from a lens of privilege. And the privilege is, especially when we're talking Kanye in the context of his arguments, because again, he's still pushing the slavery was a choice, and they could have been free if they wanted to be, but they just all tripping. They need to think like him and they would have been free. And we still slaves today. We need to be freer. Again, Kanye is speaking from the privileged lens of somebody who never had to endure slavery, who never had, especially the idea of American chattel slavery, never lived it, probably never will. And so he's speaking from someone who's always known what it's like to be free, and free in the context of American chattel slavery, because I don't think black people are free in this country, especially when you talk the judicial system and a few other things. But in the context of American chattel slavery, or even if you just want to talk about slavery amongst the Caribbean, Central America, South America, and North America, he's never experienced that, and a lot of people haven't either. But when Kanye said his bit about slavery was a choice, folks ate it up and ran with it and was, yeah, because if it was me, and there were whole coalitions about how folks would have been able to do this if they were slaves and if they would have just did this, but all the slaves were just all weak. Everybody was weak. We're so strong. I'm like, okay, yeah, you're so strong because, again, you live in a space where if there's any kind of atrocity that happens to you, you know that you can go and get support to help you out. That wasn't the case for those people back then. If, I don't know, somebody comes in and I don't know, stabs your mom in the chest, you know that you can call the police, but they ain't having a good week this week either. We'll get to that too. But you can go and you can get additional help. The police will come and support you. The court systems, depending on who you are and how you look and how much money you have, can support you. Like, that's not the experience of any of those people. And I just think it's in such poor taste to do that. Because again, you're also thinking with the mindset that you have in 2019. If you were to go back, you wouldn't go there with the mindset of 2019. You'd be in the same mindset that the people had in 1777 or 1619 or 1822, whatever the mindset was at the time. That's the experience you would have. You're living in a world that was something that wouldn't have even existed for the people during that time period. And now you're trying to use the experience in 2019 to try to answer to the problems of the past. And you're going to vilify and dumb down the demographics of those who had experienced that, all because you see the world through this new lens. Mind you, it's like Kanye, you and your rich self and your Kardashian wife, what we're not doing is that. That's not what we're doing today. And that's not even a diss to his wife, but the point that I'm making is this. He lives in a world that they can't relate to. So you can't sit here and try to, decipher and decode and spew out all this negative language about what they should have been doing and what we need to do next time, so don't stand in the way of the net. Like, you have a very whimsical viewpoint of what you thought slavery was. So can we spend a minute on slavery? Because y'all know this is one of my favorite subjects to talk about. We're going to be on this segment for a minute. So for those who want to get to the next story, use the timestamps and go to the next story. But anyway, like when you're talking about slavery again, I think people have to understand slavery was the heartbeat of this country. And I'm speaking about the United States. But at the time, slavery was the heartbeat of the country. So no matter where you stepped foot, slavery existed. Pretty much as far as the entity that kept the country going. It was the way that the country made its money. It was the bread and butter that built this country. And everybody in the country, pretty much it was an endorsed system. All right, you guys can try to hop on the narrative that, oh, the North was so great and they all wanted the people to be free. And because sometimes I see this argument too, where, when you start talking race and people start bringing up the Civil War, they're like, well, so and so 100,000 troops died so y'all could be free. I'm like, if you think that white folks in the 1800s took a bullet so black folks could be free, try again. But anyway, again, slavery was the heartbeat of the country. And so one of the things that I always hear people say is, well, I would have escaped the plantation and I would have went to Canada. And I always say, well, what year were you going to do that? And they're like, oh, 17, blah, 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 blah. Okay. And then it's like, well, Canada still had slavery in the 1700s. As a matter of fact, Canada didn't even abolish slavery until 30 years before the United States did. So really, the majority of the tenure that people had to be enslaved in this country, Canada was not the go-to place because Canada still had slavery. Actually, like, even if you go to it, like, you had people leaving Canada and escaping to Vermont because Vermont had freedom before Canada did. And there's also like this idea that, when folks got to Canada, even once they abolished slavery, there's this idea that when folks get to Canada, Canada was just this whimsical place where it was freedom and, you made it across the border and it was like a red carpet rollout and like a cheer wave tunnel. And then like the welcoming crowd comes out with the songs and welcome to Canada. Welcome to Canada. Would you like a drink? Like, no, Canada was trash too. Like, you got to think. Canada pretty much mirrored everything that the United States was doing at that point. And so racism didn't go anywhere. It's not like you stepped foot in Canada and everything was good. It was the same kind of nonsense. And so it's like people just have this warped perception of what slavery was. And it's like, no, it was like there was literally nowhere for you to go. Because one, you're an individual trying to take down an entire system that's backed by the masses. Every step that you take in that country, there's nowhere for you to escape. So if we go back, let's say you were somebody who was enslaved, you're in Mississippi, you want out. And so you're like, I break free from my plantation. Okay, you made it out of the plantation, what's next? Because no matter where you go, because let's say you're trying to get to Canada, all right, that's about a 2,000 mile journey. So enjoy walking that, and everywhere you go, you're gonna have to watch your back. You're not safe taking a nap. You're not safe sleeping because there are people waiting to catch you. Because again, when you talk slavery, we know that every white person did not own slaves. As a matter of fact, most white people didn't own slaves because they were too poor to own slaves. However, the plantations that existed were so wealthy that they could employ white people to work on those plantations. And a lot of those people who were working class and middle class white Americans that worked on these plantations were even more gruesome and more intense than the actual slave owners because their livelihood depended on how well they could keep slaves aligned. And so these were the ones who loved to keep their foot on your neck. These were the ones who loved to beat you and castrate you and do every and anything else that happened. And so again, it's like you couldn't even really go anywhere, even if you were somebody to escape your plantation, because where are you going? Like I said, everywhere that you go, slavery exists. And there's people waiting to get you. And so it's like, when you're bathing, all the moments and when you're vulnerable, you have to still have your guard up. You can't be sick that day. There's no, if you're trying to get to Canada or get to freedom, there's no, I got a stomach virus, I'm going to take it easy today. Oh no, because the dogs are on your trail anyway. You got to keep moving. There was no health care. It was just a horrible experience. And then in addition to that, I think one of the things that somebody like Kanye and a lot of people will have is like when you talk about slavery, there's this perception that everybody had the same mindset. And it's just a woe is me. I'm a slave and life is so horrible, but I'm just going to sit here and take it. And like, no, when you talk about how people view things, there were so many different ways that enslaved people thought. I don't like using the word slave because I feel like people were more so enslaved. Like for me, the word slave means that your entire mind has been literally just taken out and you've been conditioned to think one way. So I always like to say enslaved people. But again, like when you're talking about the mindsets, there were so many. You had some people who were like, I'm gonna be free by any means necessary. So if that means I gotta die or my kids gotta die, my wife gotta die, I gotta kill up everybody and burn down everything, it is what it is, I'm about that life. You had some who were like, I will fight for my freedom, but my family comes first. You had someone who were like, I will fight for my freedom, but I'm also scared at the same time. And you had some who were like, I'll fight for my freedom, but I'm not doing it unless everybody else comes and joins, but they being a bunch of punks, so I guess we're gonna stay here. You had some folks who didn't want to shake the table because they were definitely afraid of everything that could happen, because remember, this is the time period where there was a lot of punitive action. And so anytime somebody went out of line, everybody was, everybody ran the risk of being somebody who had to suffer under the mistake of somebody else. In addition to that, they also made examples out of people all the time. There were always the public lynchings or the beatings or everything like that. And then again, slavery varied depending on where you're at. One of the things I love about the National Museum of African American History and Culture based out here in DC is if you go to the bottom floor, they have a section where they talk about what slavery would have been like in each state, what the main product was. So, maybe this state was cotton, this state was tobacco, this state was sugarcane, this state was rice, and so on and so on, and what the experience would have been like on the plantation, how gruesome it would have been, how often you had to work, what the punishments were like all of that's in there. It's very detailed. It's really good. So you should check it out if you ever go. And then even when you talk bigger than just America, when you talk about the Caribbean and Central America and South America, you want to talk about one of the reasons why something like homophobia is so prevalent in a place like Jamaica today. You got to go back to the origins of what was happening during the slave experience in Jamaica. Because of course their main crop at the time was sugarcane. And with sugarcane, they recognized it was better for them to have more men working it because of just how physically demanding it was and how much endurance and perseverance you would need to have to work a sugarcane plantation all day. And so 70% of the slaves who were in Jamaica were men. And unfortunately for those who were in charge, as far as like the slave owners, a lot of these men were bigger than them. Based on the work that they had to do, these men started getting built. These men were, 6'8" and 300 pounds, and they do all kind of stuff. And so one of the ways that they were able to try to somewhat control the men was they pretty much, if they weren't castrating them, they were raping them publicly. Literally, you go and look in the history books. They would go and get the tallest, biggest dude, and then they would emasculate him in front of everybody, in front of the family, in front of the kids, in front of the whole plantation, in front of the town. What does that do? It psychologically puts fear into people. It makes people want to stay in place because they don't want that to be them. They don't want to experience that. So you see a grown, big, huge, giant man, and you're seeing all these crazy freaking slave owner people running a train on a guy. Picture what, that's some serious psychological damage, on top of the fact when you add in how religion was introduced very punitively, and especially when you talk about slave Bibles and how many books were missing. A lot of slave Bibles never had the book of Exodus. Why do you think that wouldn't be in there? Mainly because it has the story of Moses and, Pharaoh let my people go. Oh no. We don't need y'all getting inspired to be free and trying to uprise. So take that book out of there and take the story with David and Goliath. Any kind of story that has the small man winning, take that out. We don't need them getting any kind of no inspiration. But you can highlight the part about the slaves obey your master, because we just added that in the Bible not too long ago. Keep that one, preach that part. And so all of that ties into, it ties into why things in Jamaica are the way they are today, as far as how you see the LGBT community treated. And like I said, slavery just had so many different elements, so the experience varied, and there was no one size fits all on how to maneuver through slavery, which is why I wish people would stop always trying to criticize those who had to experience it. Be blessed and be grateful that you were born at the time that you were born, that you didn't have to live through that. And then again, when you're talking about slavery, there were a bunch of people who didn't just sit there and take that either. There were a bunch of slave rebellions. There's at least 250 slave rebellions that are documented. I'm sure there are so many more that were never recorded, mainly because depending on what was happening in that rebellion, you didn't want word getting around that, there was a successful rebellion over at that plantation, because of course that means those who were enslaved, if they took note, it could become something bigger. So I think a lot of that history and a lot of those rebellions were not documented. But a great example would be what's a good one? The German Coast Rebellion. That one was 1811. It was around the Gulf Coast, specifically around New Orleans. And so the main person who was the brains behind the operation, his idea was, all right, let's burn down all the sugarcane plantations, and then let's march to New Orleans. Let's take over New Orleans and say, either give us freedom or we gonna, it's gonna be what it is. And not, we're not gonna sing and petition and get y'all to sign something. No, if y'all don't give this to us, we gonna kill y'all. We gonna get our weapons and what you want to do. And so the rebellion begins, and so it starts at I totally forgot the man's name. I'll post his name in the picture on the side or something. But he starts the rebellion, and he goes plantation to plantation. First, they go to they try to kill his slave master. Slave master escaped, but they did kill the son. Slave master gets out, gives word to the other folks and everything like that. And so this mob, I don't even like the word mob, but this group of people, they got weapons and everything. They're going plantation to plantation, burning stuff and killing up folks. And then at the same time, they weren't even able to kill too many folks, mainly because some of those, remember when we talked about that you had so many different kind of people who were enslaved? Some of the ones who were like, y'all not messing this up for me. I just made it in the house. Or, y'all not messing this up for me. They let me get 3 days off. Harvest season is over. They said I can rest for 3 days. Y'all not messing this up. And they were giving the slave owner and the slave master a heads up. And so a lot of white folks were actually escaping it and already escaping off to New Orleans. And what ended up happening is a white militia formed. And so those who were leading, the charge and just burning down everything and ready to pop off by any means necessary, they end up going to plan B. And they're like, okay, plan B, let's bunker down at this plantation and reevaluate how we want to do this. And then that's when they got met by the militia. And they have this big giant shootout. And then most of those who were enslaved end up dying. However, you have some who escape. But first, let's go to the ones who end up getting shot. The ones who end up getting shot, their bodies get burned, their heads get chopped off, their heads get put on these spikes, and then the spikes, like a big giant stick or a pole with the head on top, they kind of get scattered all around the area. And then those who escaped off into the swamps, most of them were eventually caught, and they got it even worse. They were burned alive, they were shot, they were stabbed, they were, body parts amputated, they were tortured. And not only just tortured, but tortured in front of everybody to see. They made sure that those on the different plantations were able to witness this so they wouldn't get any other ideas to ever try this again. And then, same thing, heads chopped off, put on a spike, scattered all around. And then the main ringleader, he got it the worst. They castrated him. They cut off the you-know-what. And then they shot him, they stabbed him, they burned him, then they cut off his head, and then put his head on a spike. And then for this area of about 60 miles, you just saw body parts of those who participated in the rebellion scattered all around and put on display. So everybody in those plantations that were in that region would recognize this is probably not the smoke that we want. So when we talk about something like slavery, again, if you're in a system that is endorsed in the very space that you walk on, and there's nowhere for you to go because you can't trust anybody, you don't know who's out to get you, you don't know who you can trust, you're not safe, and no matter where you go, there's no safety net. It's like playing a game of tag and there's no base, or hide and seek and there's no base. You can't run forever. Eventually you get tired. Eventually you have to take that moment to take a nap, to breathe, to eat, to get some water, and then that's when you would get caught up. That's when somebody would snatch you up. And so again, it's in such poor taste to constantly put out a narrative that those who had to endure something like slavery are weak. In reality, if you are here today as a black American, or even anybody who shares black skin that had to endure the element of slavery as far as what's in your lineage, then you came from the strongest. You came from those who actually made it. Those who went through the worst beatings, those who went through, because again, there's no health care. If you're sick, it don't matter. You got to keep working. Those in your lineage went through the worst of the worst and made it. And so for you to crap on all of those people, I'm trying to stop using profanity in my videos, but you know what I want to say. For you to go and, talk down on the experience of all of those before you, it's in such poor taste. I can't respect that. I don't care how good anybody's music is. I don't suffer from Soul Train syndrome. No remix or no version of any song is going to make me change my mind if I think you're wrong. Anyway, moving on. And one more thing, because I ain't done yet. I'm sorry, I felt something else in my spirit I needed to say. I think we also forget the trauma that those who experienced slavery dealt with. And I think we forget that these people were human, and we never talk about pretty much what happened internally to all of these people who had to live through this every day. Think about when people go through traumas. A lot of us end up going through one or two major traumas in our life, usually the death of a loved one or something else happens. Sometimes it's something as simple as a bad car accident. I guess my trauma would be my father dying when I was 26. But, imagine the experience of every day as a trauma. Every single day. Because think about it, when some of those, like I said, some people who go through one or two traumas, they go through something and they never bounce back. They lose their minds, they lose themselves, they end up in a space where they're no longer the person you once knew. Imagine the experience of somebody who lives through that every single day. Every single day is a trauma. Every single day is a period of uncertainty. Every day. You're born into that system. You and whoever you decide, sometimes you ain't have a choice, who you procreate with during that time period, the offspring, they're born into that same system of trauma, and it's generational, and it goes and it goes and it goes and it goes. That's an experience that you can't criticize from a lens of wealth, and just because you're a celebrity and people think you're the freaking God's gifted man, that all of a sudden you're the gatekeeper on how people should respond to something as tribal as something like slavery, especially again when it was endorsed and it was used and pretty much enforced through violence. Come on, anyway. All right, shifting gears here just because I want to go to something a little happier for a brief moment. There's a man in Alabama who they now believe is sickle cell free. He was a part of a trial program where pretty much they're doing something you call gene therapy treatment. And I think this is a big deal, mainly because we know sickle cell anemia or sickle cell disease is something that really tends to affect African Americans at a much higher rate than other groups of people. Also, other groups of people who are affected by it at high rates, people that tend to come from India, Saudi Arabia, and places around the Mediterranean as well. And so, for the longest, a lot of times people were being misdiagnosed with the version that they had because there's multiple versions of this disease. At first, they only thought there was one or two, and then it turned out, okay, no, there's actually a bunch. So there's hemoglobin SS, hemoglobin SC, hemoglobin beta, hemoglobin beta 0, hemoglobin SO, hemoglobin SD, hemoglobin SE. I think that's all of them. But like I said, there were some people who were being misdiagnosed. I remember reading in T-boz's book, as a child, she was diagnosed with the wrong version. And so that pretty much made her experience even worse because, they pretty much told her, okay, you're probably going to die before, you hit age 40. And because she was being treated with the wrong treatments, she had an extremely gruesome experience until later down the line they discovered, no, you've been misdiagnosed. You still have the disease, but you have this version of it, and they're able to get her the right kind of treatments. But again, like for sickle cell, what tends to happen is, we're all given our red blood cells, and they tend to be more like a round or oval type shape. And then people who have sickle cell anemia tend to have cells that are more of like a crescent shape, and so a lot of times they will clog in the veins, and pretty much it depletes oxygen from your other organs, and that can lead to other things. So sometimes people feel an extremely painful sensation in their hands or their feet, or sometimes it feels like they're being stabbed by like 1,000 safety pins or needles everywhere. Some people, like their eyes can yellow, a few other things. There's a lot, and so it's an intense disease to live with, and it's a painful experience for those who end up having those sickle cell attacks. So I think this is a really big deal. Hopefully this can amount to something great. That when they have these kind of discoveries, you got to still give it some years and go through the trials and make sure that everything is safe. But from what I read, as far as how they're doing the treatment, like I said, when they do the gene therapy treatment, they're pretty much doing something where they're taking bone marrow and realigning something with the genes and the genetics, and then they're taking the strain of some other disease, but the parts that are not going to cause infection or anything crazy. And then I think from there, they go into like a chemotherapy, and the chemotherapy is supposed to somehow introduce the new blood cells into whatever. And it's complicated. I was reading that like, what? This is why I did not go to med school, okay? But so I think that would be a really great opportunity for people to really have a better shot at treating the disease, because there's so many layers to it. And I know a few people who suffer from sickle cell, so I think it's a cool story. In addition to that, congrats on order to Simone Biles, who is now the most decorated gymnast of all time. And I think that's super dope because she's so young. Like, she's still in her prime too. Like, I'm anxious to see what all she'll be able to do before she chooses to retire or go into something else. Because she's been killing the game, like just killing it. I always like when I be seeing people just do well. I always enjoy seeing that. And again, I think it goes back to the conversation we had on a few videos back, where I was talking about like a lot of these sports that you used to not really see a lot of African Americans in. And mind you, there's always been black gymnasts, especially with the girls, but with the guys, you've never seen a lot. I've always thought it was a conversation just about access. And like I said, you can go to any hood, you can see little boys flipping off of cars and flipping off trees and all night, all day. But I think you're going to see a shift in the sports world over the next 20 years where you see people who, share black skin in sports that you used to not always see them in. Because a lot of these sports, we have a history. And I was glad somebody mentioned it in my comments, because I think I said hockey was one of them. But when you talk about some of the first hockey leagues, especially in Canada, even though I just finished cooking Canada earlier, there were black hockey leagues, and those were some of the very first ones before hockey became a thing. And so I really think you're going to see a shift in a lot of the sports as you start to grant access. And really, access is just, a way for people to get to these facilities or get into these camps and everything like that. Even though, to be honest, I'm not super big on black people as a collective always being in sports, because I think we get exploited in the sports world. Because even with the conversations around NCAA and, college athletes not being paid, even though California just had their new law where they're like, oh, actually, no, you can make some money off your name if you're a college athlete. And you've seen what happens. I think we talked about the book $40 Million Slave. Or was it $20 Million Slave? One of the two. But just a few points on all that. But anyway, going back to Simone Biles, I just think it's really dope. So I can't wait to see what else she has up her sleeve, because she's clearly not even done. Like, she has so much more to do. So that's really dope for her. Shifting gears, because I did want to talk about the situation with Atatiana Jefferson. First of all, I'm going to say that was an extremely triggering video to sit through. But we've already seen that the officer, Aaron Dean, he had already resigned, and now he's being charged with murder. But if you didn't know at this point, I think most of you know, I'm a little delayed on this story, but her neighbor called in for a wellness check because he noticed that her door was open and the lights were on all night and that just didn't seem right. So, he called the non-emergency number, wanted a wellness check just to make sure everything was good, and next thing you know, she's dead in her own house. There was the officer, Aaron Dean, who went up, and the body cam footage was released, and you see her go to the house. He sees the figure in the window, and then he just shoots. Like, he just says, like, put your hands up, and shoots. Like, literally, I think she had less time than Tamir Rice had to comply. And again, here's this conversation of everybody always being in fear or seeing a perceived threat. But this one's even more interesting because it was like, well, she's in her house. You're from the outside looking in, and people were trying to say, well, she had a weapon in the house. But I'm like, she didn't have the weapon on her. But even if she had it on her, she's in her house. In a state like Texas, that's an open carry state where people can take their AK-47s to Walmart if they want to. So again, interesting dynamic. We'll see where it goes. But, based with what just happened with Amber Geiger or her situation, we'll see. But interesting. It's really sad for her, though. And then for the little boy, I feel bad for because the nephew literally saw it all happen. And he had to explain to everybody to the authorities what happened, which I think that's some traumatizing experience there as well. And it's just so sad that you constantly keep having this same cycle happen over and over. Like if you followed my YouTube channel for years, like we can't even count how many of these videos we've done where we had to talk about somebody unarmed or somebody being killed by the police unjustly. Like at this point, I've lost count. I could literally make a playlist of how many of those exist. And mind you, I didn't cover every story. I just covered the ones I could get to. So folks got to do better. And for the father, I feel bad because that was his only child. Like that's a horrible experience. They tell you don't take matters into your own hands because they don't want you to end up and do a George Zimmerman. And so they tell you, try to abide by what we have, and then you end up using the services, and look what happened. And then it kind of sucks for the neighbor as well. He just really wanted to make sure that she was good, and now, that's some guilt on his heart. All because, trigger-happy police officer, sees a figure moving. First thing he does is shoot. I'm like, goodness. And it almost brings me to the Dakota Bright case. I don't know if you remember this one. This was out of Chicago. Now, this one was from way back in 2012, but it's just now being settled. And so Dakota Bright was a 15-year-old kid. Somehow he ended up in some situation. He was on a foot chase with police, and he ends up getting shot in the back of the head. Now, back in 2012, there was a bunch of hoopla and everything, and so this has been going through the motions as far as all the different oversight committees and the independent police review boards and so on and so on, and they had finally brought everything to the Chicago Advisory Board, and the oversight committee had recommended that, okay, the police officer needs to be charged because he's been found in the wrong. The kid was on foot, he was running away, he didn't have a weapon, he wasn't aggressive, and of course he shot in the back of the head, meaning he wasn't even facing you, so there was no perceived threat. And then their argument was, well, we did find a weapon near, the area where the chase first started. And again, it's almost hard to even want to take that as fact because we've seen so many instances where the police plant things on people or where they make up stories. I'll always remember the case in Maryland where the guy, and I think I've referenced this a few times, but it's always my favorite one to come to, where you had the guy who he ends up getting arrested for marijuana in Maryland. So he's in the back of the police cruiser. Somehow he ends up dead. And their argument was, he shot himself in the back of the head. And I was like, wait a minute. So let me get this straight. One, nobody's going to kill themselves over a marijuana charge because it's not going to, especially at the time period, no, you're not going to be facing 20 years for that marijuana charge because one, he didn't have enough for it to be that big of a felony. But second, if you frisk, when you frisk somebody, how did you not feel a gun? Strike two. Strike three is, if he's cuffed and everything, and he's sitting in the police cruiser with his hands cuffed behind his back, how is he able to somehow reach and get a gun and somehow cock the gun back and aim it perfectly and shoot himself in the head in the car? And nobody saw anything, and he had perfect aim, and somehow he was able to do all this with his hands cuffed behind his back. Unless he's one of them people that are like those dancers that can do all the arm type stuff, I don't want to hear it. So anyway, they decided not to charge the police officer in the Dakota Bright case. And so I'm sure we're going to hear more about this. It should probably start hitting the news wave soon. But again, for that family, they've been going through the motions for 7 years. And then, of course, after you've gone through all that, you've got an oversight committee, you've got an independent police review, and they're telling you this officer needs to be charged, and it still doesn't even happen. They're like, oh, no, we voted 5-3. He's off, and he gets to go back to work. He gets to go back in November and go right back out in the street. Like, come on. So again, that cycle's continuing. Hot mess. Anyway, let's move on. And then I know we've seen this story coming out of Pennsylvania with the racist school teacher that decided to tell the black man who she got into a small fender bender with on the property of the school what she thought about him. And so let's go to the video really quick.
That's right. Always looking to milk the system. And you see me, a white woman, so you think I got money. That's why you're
Not even a little bit. Don't even look like you got it. Not even a little bit.
Go back to your welfare, your Section 8 house. See the big truck I have? I can pay cash for that.
Mad and nervous, I understand. I'm sorry? This situation can change real quick.
Oh, yeah? What are you going to do about it?
You better stay over there is what I'm going to tell you. You better stay over.
You bring it on.
You better stay over there is what I'm going to tell you.
Bring it on. Bring it back.
So with this story, again, I think this goes back to questioning, like, who exactly do you have teaching your children? Because with her, she's actually a teacher at that school, and she had been there since 2008. So we know for sure, at least for the last 11 years, she's been teaching a school that's majority black. And so if those are her viewpoints after a slight fender bender, mind you, you see the truck, there's no real damage, maybe a scratch or something. If that's her first initial reaction, and she's not even in a space where she can really control how she feels, and those are the first words that come out of her mouth, and she knows she's on camera and she doesn't care. Imagine how many students have gone through her classroom who had to deal with some overly punitive response to something. How many students got some kind of referral or a write-up, or how many students may have been failed, or how many students may have been suspended or put into detention for something they may not have even done. Or maybe if they did do something, the punishment was so extreme based on her viewpoints and her ideology. So again, it goes back to that conversation of questioning who we have teaching the children. And then, like, that video alone could go into so many. Oh, you could go to so many places with that video. Because even the bit where she says the bit about the whole welfare, like, yeah, probably on welfare. I'm like, gee, I wonder what she thinks about the rest of her students. And that means most likely if she doesn't value the life of these students as far as her thinking that she's above them, that also would mean that she's not going to put her best foot forward in making sure that they get the best that they can get when it comes to education. I personally think that if you're somebody who works in the community, if you're somebody who's a teacher, or you do an after-school program or a daycare or something like that, if it's not in your heart to really, give your best and give your all to the population in which you serve, don't go into that field, because the children don't deserve, some half-assed job. I just think for the children, they don't deserve some of the atrocities that we as adults place on them. And so when it comes to something like education or just anything like that, I think if you're going to work in that field, you got to give it your all and be willing to give your best to any child in that program. If you can't do that, don't work there. You know what I mean? Especially the location she's in. If the school's like 60% black, like, clearly you need to go on to some other area where you can be amongst your own and y'all can kind of do whatever y'all do. But, like, it just makes me question what happens. And then when you talk about the suspension rates when it comes to black students with teachers who tend to be white women and just some of the things you've seen happen, there's a lot of conversations to be had. May not be conversations people want to hear, but that's the reality. If that's the reaction after a small fender bender, little bump with the truck bumper, and you kept going, and that's the first thing to come out of her mouth, that means she probably feels that way all the time. That was just that she had the opportunity to say it because the accident triggered how she really felt. Absolutely crazy. Anyway, let's wrap this up because this video was... Actually, y'all say it annoys y'all when I say the video was long. So we'll say that this video was very extensive. All right. Share your 2 cents. I'm out. Subscribe.